After failing the weapon trial for what felt like the 100th time, I had to know how damage really works. So, I finally took a deep dive into the battle guide for the first time. As I started to unravel how damage calculation works, I realized that without a math degree, I might struggle with terms like multiplicative and additive. So, I decided to close the game and see if I could find some answers online. I came across a bunch of resources, videos, a damage calculator, and even a Reddit post trying to explain where damage comes from. But here's the thing. While some of these resources are pretty close, they tend to fall apart once you start mixing in factors like damage increase, damage reduction, tarot skills, and resonance. Let's break down how different the damage calculation can be. First, take a look at my character, Maida. She has the following setup. Weapon, a level 50 newborn blade. Trinket, coexist armor, also at level 50, providing a 10% damage reduction. Resonance, reduces physical damage by 15%. Tarot Whisper, a level 60 hermit, giving 20% damage reduction. Trait, adds 12% damage reduction. Amida has the ability to block, providing an additional 20% damage reduction. With all these factors combined, let's see how the numbers play out in-game. Maitha's final defense is 912, and I've applied a buff that reduces damage taken by 30%. With these factors combined, she should have an 87% damage reduction. If she blocks the attack, she will gain an additional 20% damage reduction. The enemy's final attack power is 2686, and his only attack is his basic attack with a skill multiplier of 100%. Using the damage calculator, it shows that the damage we will take is 184. Now let's see what happens in-game. So, we've seen that the damage calculator isn't quite matching up with what we're experiencing in-game. But what if I told you there's a way to solve this once and for all? Here's the plan. We're going to travel to the future. That's right, we're heading to China. Wait, China? Yep. They've had the game for a year longer than us, so they must have figured out all the nuances of damage calculations by now. Spoiler alert, they didn't. First, I found a site that classified buffs as multiplicative and non-buffs as additive, but it was completely wrong. Then, I stumbled on another site that tried to explain damage increase and reduction. This one was right about all the damage modifier, but it failed to determine how your final stat worked. Finally, there was this one source that almost nailed it, but it had a few things off. It turns out the global version is pretty inaccurate, and the Chinese version, though more reliable, still misses some key details. So I decided, you know what? I'm going to finish the job myself. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. At first, I thought I just needed to change a few numbers and the formula would be completed. However, the more tests I conducted, the more I realized that the formula that came closest to the truth was completely wrong. So, I had to break down the formula into pieces to identify where the error was occurring. Now let's start by breaking down the formula. This is how the game calculates damage. You start by subtracting the enemy's final defense from your final attack. Then you multiply that by the skill multiplier. Finally, you multiply by the damage multiplier. Simple enough, but how do we determine your final attack, defense, or damage multiplier? This is where the game starts to get confusing. Let me start by explaining defense, the easiest one to understand. To get your final defense. The final defense equals your base defense multiplied by the effect of ignored defense, and then that result is multiplied by the sum of your defense increases and decreases. To find your base defense, look at the bottom left corner when you select a character. The first row shows your attack stats, divided into physical and magical attack. The second row displays your defense stats, split into physical and magical defense. The third row includes max HP and speed. Keep in mind that your speed remains constant regardless of gear or level, it only changes with buffs or tactical skills. So, the key stats to focus on are the 5 others: physical attack, physical defense, magical defense, and max HP. Now, how do we find out your base defense? Let's break it down using this formula. We'll use Nono Will as an example. First, we need to determine her base physical defense. To do this, remove all her gear. With her gear removed, the stats displayed at the bottom are not her raw stats. We also need to account for any stats from the talent tree. Then, even after doing all of that, it still isn't her raw stat. We also need to remove any stats she's getting from her bond level. Once we have her raw stats, it's straightforward to determine her base physical defense. For instance, a level 55 Nono Will with her bond level at 3, she has a raw physical defense of 320.85. After re-equipping all her gear, the game shows a base physical defense of 693. Let's verify this. We take into account all the flat and percentage increases from her gear and talent tree. Nono will get a 21% increase, an additional flat amount of 293, and a 3% boost from her bond level. Applying the formula, her base physical defense should be 692.88, and rounding up gives us 693, which matches the in-game result. Well, you might ask, why would I need to calculate her base stat if the game already tells you how much you're getting? That's the issue. As you can see, the result is 692.88, and the game rounds it up to 693. However, when calculating damage, the game uses 692.88 instead of 693. While this doesn't matter in 98% of cases, you start to see a 1 damage difference if you rely on the rounded up number. The same method applies to all the base stats. The next step in calculating your final defense is dealing with ignored defense. If you have any buffs that grant ignore enemy defense, they all work together multiplicatively. For example, with Taro's Ray of the Sun, you're getting minus 20% ignore defense twice. Since these effects work multiplicatively, you'll end up with 64% of the enemy's defense. A quick note, Taro's Ray of the Sun states that when attacking injured enemies you get this effect. However, it also applies to dying enemies. The last step in calculating your final defense involves applying your defense modifiers. Whether these come from buff or non-buff, they are all additive. Remember, they are added at the end of the formula. That's how you get your final defense stat. Now that we know how to calculate your final defense, let's talk about how to determine the damage multiplier. How can we tell if the damage multiplier is additive or multiplicative? It's quite simple. For the attacker, all damage increases or decreases that affect the attacker are additive. For the defender, all damage reductions and damage taken that affect the defender are multiplicative. The game states that you can't go below minus 50%, but this only applies to the attacker. The defender, however, can go beyond minus 50% damage reduction. Another important point is the 300% damage multiplier cap. I tested it, and it seems to refer to the defender rather than the final result of the damage multiplier. That's how you get your damage multiplier. You might ask how it took a year to figure out how this game's damage calculation works. Well, it's because of how the game calculates your final attack. You might think it should work the same as defense or the damage multiplier, but it doesn't. So, how do we know which attack modifiers are additive or multiplicative? The truth is, you don't really know. The game doesn't tell you. The only way to find out is by testing everything in the game and reverse calculating the damage numbers you see in-game. That's why I'm here, to make things easier for you. While the game doesn't directly indicate what is additive or multiplicative, I found that there are certain keywords that can reveal whether those modifiers are additive or multiplicative. Let me show you the formula to determine your final attack. First, you multiply the base attack by the result of the increase minus the decrease. Then you add any grants you have. Next, you multiply this value based on your roll advantage or disadvantage. Finally, you take the base attack and multiply it by the increase condition, while also considering the effects of being in highland or lowland areas, and then you add this to the total. So what exactly are increase, decrease, grant, and increase condition? Let me first explain buffs. Buffs are divided into two categories: buff effects and non-buff effects. Buffs are visible on your status screen, while non-buff do not appear there but still affect your stats. Buffs have 6 types that I know of so far: buff, debuff, aura, leader's aura, state, and terrain. Non-buffs have 8 types that I know of so far: trait, passive, reaction, talent passive, resonance, weapon skill, trinket skill, and some tarot skills. The only rule is that the same type does not stack but will overwrite the stat that provides the most benefit. For example, let's take the aura from Angel, which gives 30% magic defense, and the aura from Gloria, which provides 12% attack and defense for both physical and magical. If you use both auras, you will receive 12% physical attack, 12% magical attack, 12% physical defense, and 30% magical defense. Now that you understand how buffs work, let's continue with the formula. From what I've seen, increase and increase condition gives you an attack percentage boosts, while grant gives you a flat attack bonus. If your buff or non-buff uses the word increases, it goes into the increases part of the formula. If it says grants, it fits into the grants section. And if it's an increases with a condition, then it belongs in the increases condition part of the formula. To my knowledge, only debuffs have the keyword decrease. Understanding this makes the whole process much clearer. Let me show you a few examples. Newborn Blade, it uses the word grants, so it goes in the grants section. Meteor Line, this one says increases, so it fits into the increase section. Beheading Machete, it also uses increase, but with a condition to activate the attack bonus, so it goes in the increase condition section. Fakel's trait uses the word increase, so it goes in the increase section. Might's trait has the word increase twice. The first line goes to the increase section, while the second line goes to the increase condition section. Resonance Sword plus Pentacle goes into the increase condition section. The Trinket True Lens fits into the increase section. The buff ATK also goes into the increase section. You get the gist of it by now. But there's one exception. Resonance Sword plus Wand goes into the increase section, not in the increase condition section. Now there's a fourth keyword, gains, but this one doesn't follow any clear pattern. I strongly believe it's either a translation error or an oversight from the devs. The first one is the Pendant Halberd, which works the same as an increase condition. The second one is the Hollow Axe, which works the same as a grants. Lastly, No-No-Will's traits operate the same as an increase. A quick note about the Hollow Axe and Newborn Blade. The game states that you're getting a physical attack increase at the start of the battle. However, it's actually based on your current defense. So, if your defense increases or decreases at any point of the battle, your attack will adjust accordingly. Roll advantage and disadvantage. For Defender, Breaker, and Seeker, you get a 30% attack increase or decrease, depending on whether you have a roll advantage or disadvantage. For Watcher and Destroyer, it's a 40% attack increase or decrease. Island or Lowland. If you hold the high ground, you gain a 15% attack increase. But if you're in Lowland, you face a 10% attack decrease. Injured or dying. If you are injured state, your damage is decreased by 20% and the damage taken by 20%. If you are in a dying state, your damage is decreased by 30% and the damage taken by 30%. Now that we know how to calculate your final attack, final defense, and damage multiplier, let's put the formula to the test and see if it's accurate. We have here a level 53 Ruia fully equipped. She's getting a 5% physical attack equal to her physical and magical defense. Her trinket provides a 1% physical attack boost. The resonance adds a 5% damage increase, and from her tarot she's receiving a 20% ignore defense effect twice on injured enemies. Her trait gives her a 25% damage increase, while her leader's aura adds 10% attack and 8% damage increase. Her base attack is 2,197. Additionally, she's benefiting from Gloria's aura, giving her a 15% attack and defense increase, a buff that boosts her damage by 30% and 40% magic defense, and she's in an injured state, attacking from the high ground. We also have the roll advantage in play. The enemy has a base defense of 477. His reaction skill provides a 30% damage reduction, and his passive grants a 20% defense boost. He is also in a dying state. Ruia will attack using her basic attack, which has a 100% skill multiplier and provides a 15% crit damage increase. After applying everything, the damage we'll deal is 4,955.25. If we land a crit, the damage we will deal is 7,185.11. As you can see, the damage displayed in-game is 4,955, just as shown in the formula. Let's run a test on the defender side now. We have a level 53 Maida fully equipped. She's benefiting from a 10% damage reduction from her trinket. The resonance adds 15% physical damage reduction, and from her tarot she's receiving 10% damage reduction twice. Her trait provides an additional 12% damage reduction, and her passive will be granting a 40% defense increase. Her base physical defense is 912. The buffs she's receiving are a 20% defense increase, a 30% damage reduction, and a 50% damage reduction. On the other side, the enemy has a base attack of 1427, with the traits giving them a 25% damage increase. The enemy also has the roll advantage and will be attacking from the low land. The enemy will attack using her skill Tearing Whirlwind, which has a 90% skill multiplier and deals AoE damage. After applying everything, the damage we'll receive is 54.36. If she lands a crit, we'll be hit with 70.67 damage. Let's see what happens. Wait, hold up, maybe the game bugged out or something. Let's rewind for a second. Oh my god, does this mean the formula doesn't work? Was I explaining all this for the past 10 minutes for nothing? Alright, let's take a deep breath and analyze the situation. Her attack skill has a 90% multiplier, and she's dealing AoE damage. AoE damage. That's it. Here's the exception. AoE damage isn't affected by highland, lowland, or back attacks. Now, let's adjust the formula and remove the lowland factor to see if the damage matches the in-game result. Phew, that was a close one. Buffs? There's another type I forgot to mention, unique buffs. The game still calls them buffs, but these can stack with other buffs that provide the same effect. Remember when I did the test with Maida? There were two buffs that reduced damage yet both applied. That's because Shield of Light is a unique buff, while the damage reduction buff is a standard one. An easy way to spot unique buffs is by their names, which usually don't relate to their effect. Meanwhile, regular buffs are named after their effect and come with a tier next to their name. Multi-attacks. Let me show you a quick example of how this interaction plays out. The key things to keep in mind are the enemy's reaction skill, Glare, that reduce 8% damage reduction and the debuff he inflicts on us when attacking. For multi-attacks, they work similarly to normal attacks, but only the first hit determines the damage for the subsequent hits. If one hit is a critical, the damage will be based on that first hit. Even if the enemy applies a negative effect, it won't affect the damage of the subsequent hits. But there's an exception. No-No-Will's skill, Thousand Blades, each hit works independently. We're testing against the same enemy, but keep in mind that No-No-Will has the Emperor Tarot equipped. The first hit works as expected. But on the second hit, the damage decreases because the debuff the enemy applies affects the subsequent hits. However, the reaction skill that provides an 8% damage reduction only applies to the first hit. On the third hit, the damage drops again. This is because the enemy's HP falls below 75%, putting them in an injured state. While they take 20% more damage in this state, we lose the Emperor Tarot's 25% damage increase against healthy enemies, resulting in lower overall damage. Round down or up? After countless tests, I still can't say for sure how the game rounds numbers. I know I mentioned earlier that the game might use decimals in your raw stats, but honestly that's just a guess. If anyone wants to figure out exactly how it works, go for it, I'd love to know. The rounding method I use is to round down your final attack and defense if the decimal is 0.29 or lower, and round up if it's above 0.5. For damage dealt, it seems to follow the normal rule of rounding up if it's above 0.5, and rounding down if it's lower. As for critical damage, you always round down. Keep in mind, when calculating crit damage, you don't multiply directly after getting the non-crit damage, but after it's rounded. So, when you crit, the number gets rounded twice. I know it's weird, but this is how I got the formula to work. And if the result is off, it's only by 1 damage, whether it's a non-crit or a critical hit. What happens if your final defense is higher than the final attack? It was believed that your defense can't be above 95%, but that's also false. After some testing, I reached to the conclusion that your defense can't be above the range of 96.35% to 96.4% of the attacker final attack. On the left side we have Edda with exactly 95% of the attacker final attack, while on the right side we are above 95%. As you can see, the damage is lower on the right side. That should be everything. If I left something out or made a mistake, let me know in the comments down below. I appreciate you watching.